Probably one of the best definitions of the role of a godly woman or godly mother is become famous for this. Sometimes people even refer to it as the Proverbs 31 woman, because that passage so definitively gives a resume for womanhood in terms of the womanhood of that day at least. But if you look at the qualities of this type of a lady that you see in Proverbs 31, you're going to see that these qualities would transfer to any dispensation. There are certain qualities that would be godly and honorable qualities no matter what era you would find them in. In that 31st chapter of Proverbs, it starts out by talking about how these proverbs, and I think that's true of the entire chapter, by the way, were prophecies. That's an interesting statement. I'm not looking at it, so maybe I better look over at that. They were prophecies that were given to King Lemuel by his mother. And you want to talk about some godly motherly advice that Lemuel's mother gave. Notice the very first verse, the words of King Lemuel, the prophecy that his mother taught him. Now, sometimes the word prophecy or to prophesy refers to foretelling the future. You could get pretty poetically creative and say this is maybe foretelling the future if he found a wife like this is described here, or if he lived the life like she was mandating here. But I don't think that's what this means. I think this is the other meaning of the word prophecy. And this is the easy way to remember it. I don't know who created these two alliterated words, but they perfectly describe what prophecy is. It is either foretelling, talking about something's future, or it's forthtelling. Now, forthtelling is kind of a made-up word, but forthtelling is intended to convey the idea that it is a direct communication. God is talking to you. He may not be telling you about the future, but He's talking directly to you. It's not a second-hand type of communication. If a prophet says, "Thus saith the Lord, I want you to do such and such," that part of it isn't telling you anything about the future. That's telling you God's directions right at this moment. Now, he might go on to say, if you do such and such, this is what will happen, then that'd be the foretelling part of it. But I think this prophecy was that Lemuel's mother was touched by the God of heaven and gave these words to her son. And that's why it's called a prophecy, that these were God's words given through his mother. It wasn't just his mother's wise advice. This is God's advice about these things that came through his mother. King Lemuel, it's very difficult to determine who he might have been. There's a lot of debate. Some think King Lemuel was King Hezekiah. His mother would have been Abiah, who was the daughter of Zechariah. Probably was a very godly woman, and that would make sense, but there's some complicated reasons why that may not be the case, and the most traditional view is that Lemuel was Solomon. It doesn't really matter who Lemuel was, whether he was a king somewhere outside of Israel or a king of Israel like Hezekiah or Solomon. He was a king who had a mother who apparently was touched by God and had a prophecy to her son to give him some instructions on the type of life that he should live. And as a king, she didn't go into a lot of detail as here's what all you need to do as a man, but she did address a couple of things that are critical for you to do as a king. Somebody in a position of authority has to follow certain guidelines for the type of life that they live, because if you don't follow certain guidelines, you can subvert judgment. You can corrupt judgment. You can get yourself in a situation where you're not in a state, and you're going to see what I mean by state in a moment. You're not in a mental or emotional state where you can make the right kind of judgments. And a king has to be able to make the right kind of judgments, saints. And by the way, a child of God does too. A child of God has to be able to make the right kind of judgments. So the same kind of things that would be applicable to a king would be applicable to those of us who are striving to be kings and priests, wouldn't it? But King Lemuel's mother says to him in this prophecy, "What, my son, and what the son of my womb, and what the son of my vows?" That's a whole lot of ways of stressing that he's her son, isn't it? You're my son. You're the son of my womb. You're the son of my vows, which means, looks like she's made some promises related to her son, or perhaps even that are promises she's required of her son, her vows. We all have that for our children, don't we? We have certain things we want for our children, or those that we feel like we can influence in a positive way. "Give not thy strength unto women," there's one of her pieces of advice, "nor thy ways to that which destroyeth kings." Now, by the way, this doesn't mean don't get married. It doesn't mean never fall in love. Don't let any person of the opposite gender get close to you, Don't trust them. That's not what it means at all. If this was talking to Solomon, this is really a shame. Because if this was Solomon, he definitely didn't follow this instruction. He gave his strength to women. He spread his strength out among too many women. Listen, saints, it doesn't matter how much you go back to the patriarchs, and nobody's done this. I've never had any of you men come to me and ask if you could justify getting into a second marriage along with your first. And you better be glad, ladies, that's the case, because I'd have to light somebody up if they did, and you probably would light them up long before I did. But the fact of the matter is you don't get to marry a second spouse. We're not Mormons, and we're not trying to be. It doesn't matter what Abraham did or Isaac or Jacob. Those individuals were living in a day where there's a lot of things they did they shouldn't have been doing. And God was working toward a standard that you might think He just would have it full bore in the beginning, but He didn't. He progressively tightened things. You realize He had laws regarding slavery in the Mosaic Law? You think God is okay with slavery? Do you realize how long it took to get slavery being taken out of the world? And it's not out of the world now. There's slavery all over this world. But to get slavery taken out of the part of the world that's been influenced by the Judeo-Christian worldview, it took some great and mighty men and women of God to get rid of slavery. And it took a long time. God was progressively tightening things down. God was progressively getting rid of some things. And bigamy, or whatever it is to have multiple spouses, is not something God approves. If you had more than one wife, you've already stretched yourself too thin. You've given your strength to women, and you can't do it. But you can give your strength to a woman, and you should. If you're married, you should give your strength. Your strength should be shared with your spouse. Ladies, your strength, and you have strength too. We're going to see it in these verses. Your strength should be shared with your husband. You're a strength for your husband. And if you don't have a husband or you don't have a wife, that doesn't mean that same strength that God put in you that potentially could be used in terms of the relationship with a husband or wife cannot be invested in a different kind of way in other relationships, in a different kind of way. The same kind of strength you can give to encourage and to uplift and to build up your spouse can be done in the lives of other people too. If you don't have a spouse, so those same qualities that you see in the life of somebody that's a godly woman or a godly man can be shared with others even if you aren't able to be in a relationship, if you've lost your spouse. That's another thing that breaks my heart. We've got precious people in this assembly who have lost their spouse, some long ago. We've got precious people in this assembly. I started saying about some of our mothers. We've had mothers that have lost their children. That's devastating. We've had those who long to be mothers who have not been able to have children. That's devastating. Every one of those we ought to be lifting up to God on Mother's Day. You think Mother's Day is just about the people that are mothers? Mother's Day is about people that have been mothers, people that would like to be mothers, people that are presently mothers. If there's somebody that longs with all their heart to be a mother, we ought to be praying with all of our strength on Mother's Day. Lord, on this day when we're honoring mothers, will you honor them by opening their womb and letting them be a mother as they're so longing to be? Or if they're past that point, He can give people to you in your life that you can be a mother to. So there's precious ladies that have never been mothers that long to be mothers. There's precious ladies that have been mothers that have lost their children. Those two things just tear your heart out. There's precious ladies that are mothers whose children are not serving the Lord. It is more difficult for God to bring some people into church than to raise them from the dead. Because if you've put your child in the hands of God, they're going to get a resurrection, saints. But there's some people who are rejecting God and are willfully standing against Him, and God's not going to force them to come to Him. He might coax them, He might put them in terrible situations to get their attention, but He's not going to force you against your will to serve Him. He may make it so that you don't think there's any other option, but you still could say no and suffer on. That's why I've said through the years that I hope you mothers appreciate this. It's harder for mothers. Fathers kind of get gung-ho about it. That's right, because we're just that way. But mothers, I know you're kind of cringing when I say, I pray your children go through terrible things. But I do. If your children are outside the will of God, I pray they suffer horribly. What do you think of that? You still love me after saying that? You should, because the only reason I want them suffering is so that they run back to the Lord, and then I pray everything that they're suffering is lifted by the hand of God. See, because some people are not going to turn to the Lord without something shocking them, almost like somebody that hits somebody with the paddles and shocks their heart stopped. There's some people that, spiritually speaking, their heart has stopped. And if it stays that way too long, it's not going to restart. That's what happens when somebody gets to the place where they're reprobate. If their heart stops too long and it isn't shocked back into sinus rhythm, they may never come back. So we ought to pray God shock them back into spiritual sinus rhythm, where their heart starts thumping in their chest again. They start feeling something in their conscience again, is what that comes down to. So we've got precious ladies in that category. That breaks my heart too, to see some of our precious mothers whose children and grandchildren are not in church. And I don't mean in this particular church, but I mean they're not serving the Lord. God in heaven help us that all of our children will serve the Lord. That they'll never leave the Lord, or if they've left Him, that they'll return to the Lord. Listen, you can return to the Lord. There would be no point in the parable of the prodigal son if there wasn't that kind of hope. And I am a living example of that experience, that God can bring you back to the Lord even when you have rejected Him and don't even want Him. And many of you in this building are examples of that very thing. Some of you may have stayed in church all your lives and never left the Lord, and bless your precious hearts for doing it, for holding on to God. Some of you may have left the Lord, and you might have just left Him in your mind. You might have left Him in more ways than your mind. And God brought you back. Isn't that a precious thing? God can take you and draw you right back. He can do that with our children and grandchildren too. He's not beyond that. So I'm praying for that too. That's another thing that breaks my heart when we're on Mother's Day honoring our mothers, and I'm thinking about our precious mothers in our assembly, and not all of you fit any of these categories. Some of you, thank God, don't fit into any of these categories. But we've got people that long to be mothers and would like nothing more than to be able on Mother's Day to be able to celebrate Mother's Day as a mother. And it's tearing their heart right out of their chest to go through another Mother's Day without a child. We've got precious people in our assembly who have lost their children and would love nothing more than to see that child on Mother's Day again. Tears the heart out of my chest to think about it. We've got precious people that have lost their children to the world. Or maybe they don't even realize they are lost to the world because their concept of the faith and of the church is so skewed and so polluted by whatever false doctrine or cultural compromise has affected whatever they are a part of that they don't even understand that they're outside of God's economy. We've got precious individuals whose children, and we've got a number of them in this case. This isn't just a couple. We've got a number of them in this case, whose children are not living in this area near to them. And sometimes you don't realize just how hard that is on parents, you know. You get used to, well, so-and-so's children have always lived a long way away. We've got a lot of people in this category, by the way. I can look around this platform and see 1, 2, 3, 4. I can start going down through here and seeing people all around here who have children who live further away. If it's an hour or two away, or if it's 10 or 12 hours away, they don't live close. You don't get to see your children very often. That's heartbreaking. When your children aren't close. I want us to have sympathy, and if you can do it, empathy. Empathy is more powerful than sympathy. If you can have empathy for all those categories. You may not realize how much somebody's hurting when they want a child and they don't have a child, and they've been wanting a child for a long time. You may not be able to relate to that. But I hope you can enough that you can call on God for them. You may not know how much somebody's hurting when their child maybe lives several states away or even several hours away, and they don't get to see them as often as they're used to. Sometimes as you get older, you just get used to that, you know, because your children have always lived around the country in different places. But that doesn't make it any easier to be separated from your children. Have empathy for things like that. Realize it might be deeply hurting them. So I'm hoping we'll be praying for all of our precious ladies on a day like this. Let's come back to Proverbs 31. I told you this was the advice of Lemuel's mother, and it was regarding the kind of standards you need to have for a king. It, as I said, might have been talking about Solomon. It's sad if it was, because Solomon failed in this area for sure. The name Lemuel literally means given to God or belonging to God. Some people have thought it was almost like a pet name that Solomon's mother Bathsheba had for him. That's why they think this might be talking to Solomon. So maybe this was the pet name that Bathsheba had that she called Solomon, someone that she gave to God. Maybe it was another king. It doesn't really matter what king it is, but it does matter what his mom said, and it does matter what is said in the latter part of this chapter, from the 10th verse on down, that describes this godly woman. I'm not going to read through all the statements she said to him, but she did say a couple of pretty critical things to him. She said, "Give not thy strength unto women, nor thy ways to that which destroyeth kings." There's a lot of things you can give your strength to. She just gives 2 of them in this passage. But there's a lot of things you can give your strength to that will destroy a king. You give your strength to women, notice it's plural, not to a woman. I'm talking to the men when I say this. It will destroy you. You can't give your strength to women, unless they're your daughters, you know. You can't give your strength to women and it not destroy you. You can give your strength to a woman. You can share your strength with your wife, but you can't share your strength with women. Even if it's just 2 of them, you can't do it. There's no wife and mistress, you know. So you can't share your strength like that. That will destroy you. That is something that will destroy a king. You will lose your influence. You will lose your respect. You will lose the respect that needs to go with the office if you don't respect the integrity of covenants and other things, because who's going to trust you? If your wife can't trust you, it's like the problem we had back in Clinton's day, when Clinton was more than accused of adultery. However you want to define it, it's adultery as far as I'm concerned. The argument made by the liberals was we shouldn't judge somebody based on whether they're faithful to their spouse. All we need to worry about is that they're faithful in the office we've elected them to. I don't trust somebody to be faithful in that office if they can't be faithful to the nearest person in their entire life. Why would I think they'd be faithful to me if they can't be faithful to their wife? They don't even know me. I'm just one of, now what is it in the United States? 330-some million, I think the census came out. Over 300 million people in this nation. I'm one of 300 plus million. What do they care about being faithful to me? If you're going to have somebody in an office that requires faithfulness, they surely should show themselves faithful to the person who they were in a covenant with before that office, their spouse. So it's important a king has certain standards. King's standards here are pretty tight. There are things a lot of people don't want to be thinking about in our world. Number one, a king can't give his strength to women. You can't be a womanizer and be somebody who's going to be able to rule in God's economy. A king cannot give his strength to wine. There's a simple reason. Because a king is not somebody that can have their thoughts affected by something that could inebriate them. That happens when you give your strength to women too. If your lusts are driving you, you're not going to be able to make the right kind of judgments. You're going to be controlled by your lusts. If your desire for some intoxicant, whatever it is driving you, controlling you, or even, God forbid, it is affecting your clarity of mind, you are not going to be someone that's going to be able to make good judgments. You do realize when someone's inebriated, they don't make good judgments. So there's certain things a king needs to avoid. Those things will destroy kings. As you read on through here, it says, it's not for kings, in the 4th verse, O Lemuel, it's not for kings to drink wine, or for princes strong drink. And if you didn't think the reason was what I just stated, just listen to the next verse. Lest they drink and forget the law. You know what happens when your inhibitions get lowered? You forget the law. You forget it, or it just doesn't seem as important to you. You get fuzzy on things when it comes to your morality. And you could pervert the judgment of the afflicted. And we go on into the details of what that could be talking about. And I'm going to jump down to the 10th verse. She talks about other things, but those are the two things at the heart of her advice to her son. She says, avoid women and wine, son. Both of those things are going to lead to your destruction. And by the way, they won't just lead to your destruction. They'll lead to the destruction of the people you're responsible for. Because if your inhibitions are lowered by your desire for somebody of the opposite sex, and you just cannot, you can, but you just feel like, I cannot resist that. I cannot say no. Or your inhibitions are lowered by an addiction to an intoxicant of some kind. I just cannot resist that. You are not going to be able to hold your integrity. If your inhibitions can be controlled by an addiction to women or wine, you're not going to be able to hold your integrity. So that was pretty good advice from a mother to her son. But then it goes on in the 10th verse into this description of this we call a virtuous woman. I believe this is still the same prophecy. Now, it could be Lemuel is now talking, and he's saying, now this is a description of a virtuous woman. You know, my mom gave me this advice, and now let me tell you what kind of woman my mom was, and that'll be the standard for all you other ladies. I don't necessarily think that's true. It could be, but I think she's still prophesying. I think Lemuel is still giving the words of his mother's prophecy. She told him, avoid women, plural, and wine. Don't give your strength to women, plural. But now let me tell you about a virtuous woman, son, because one day I do want you to have a virtuous wife. And what's precious about these words in this last part of this chapter is that they don't just describe a wife, ladies. They describe a mother, too, because this describes somebody that's involved at the family level, not just as a spouse, but as a mother. And many of these descriptions in here could apply to somebody whether or not they've had children. Something that will allow you to be successful naturally, certainly, if you have some of these qualities, but spiritually far more. So he says, who can find a virtuous woman? For her price is far above rubies. I'm glad that God gave me a virtuous woman. I'm talking about my wife on Mother's Day. And the two mothers that would come to mind first that I would honor, other than spiritually, start talking about the church and other things that fill that role. Jerusalem, which is above, is the mother of us all, the order of God that brought us to birth spiritually and the other things. Those are important. But for those of us who, if you're a man and you are married and your wife is the mother of your children, she should be one of the mothers you should honor above any other mother, right alongside your own mother. So who can find a virtuous woman? Her price is far above rubies. There has never been a time when I thought I had anything in me or that I could ever get that would be able to purchase what God has given me in the wife that I have. I would never be able to pay the price for what God has given me. It is so far above rubies, so much more precious to me that God has allowed me to have the type of wife and the type of mother to my children that I have, that I couldn't have imagined, even as a young person, when you're thinking, and we all do as young people, about a potential spouse one day. I could not have dreamed up in my own imagination somebody better fitted for me and better for the children that we have than the precious lady that God gave me. So who can find a virtuous woman? I'll tell you who can find one if you'll trust him. You might find one, but I'll tell you who will find one for you if you'll trust him. This is what I would say to you young ladies, that if you'll trust him, God will find a virtuous man for you. Trust him. Wherever you're at, some of you are behind me, some of you are in front of me. Trust him. Don't trust your own judgment. Sometimes our own judgment gets skewed by the emotions of the moment or something going on in that moment that just seems like it's so big, it's got to be the biggest thing. There's a reason sometimes we call certain things puppy love. It's because you're not really grown up enough to know what love is once you're a full-size dog, But the fact of the matter is, puppy love is love that is as big as any puppy could imagine. You're thinking, this is the greatest thing I have ever seen. It can't get better than this. This is the person for me. But you grow a little bit further and you realize, oh my Lord, that's not the right one. I'm going to tell you right now, it's my prayer for our young men and young ladies that you wait and let God find you the right person. And if God doesn't do that, then you have the patience to wait for God in whatever area you got to wait. I've watched people determined they had to have something, whatever it was, and they didn't get it in the time they wanted it, so they made it happen and then paid a terrible price because they made it happen. They've got their own choice. They got what they wanted and they paid the price for what they wanted. I've seen people do that, and I'm praying that we don't have to experience that in the generations to come. Talking about this virtuous woman in the 10th verse, who can find a virtuous woman? We think of virtue as somebody that has good qualities, somebody that has good morals. Those are certainly true. Somebody that is honorable. This word can mean all those things, but it's kind of an extension of those things. What it really means at its heart is somebody that is a person of power or strength. Hayil in Hebrew means power or strength or capacity, or even faculty, which is like capacity. You have a certain faculty. You're really skilled in a certain area. You've got a lot of strength in a certain area. A virtuous woman is not just somebody that you say, isn't that an honorable lady? She would be. But this word's much stronger than that. It's talking about a person of might, a mighty woman, a powerful woman. This is somebody who's got great strength. And in this kind of a context, it could refer to her strength of character. She's very strong and firm in her character. It could refer to her strength in terms of her spiritual stability and her spiritual resolve, her capacity to endure. If you're going to be a godly individual, whether you're a man or a woman, you're going to have the strength to endure. Because to remain a godly man or a godly woman, you're going to have to stand through some very difficult things. You're going to have to be able to endure under some very difficult conditions and pressures and stresses. And sometimes things you think are going to break you, but I'm not going to be moved. I'm going to stay on the Lord's side, praise His holy name. I'm not going to be shifted. Another thing you might not notice in these verses, you might not notice because you're not reading Hebrew, that this is an incredibly beautiful poem in this prophecy. Every one of these verses starts with a different letter of the Hebrew alphabet in order. There's a number of psalms that do the very same thing, the 9th Psalm and the 10th Psalm, the 25th Psalm, the 34th Psalm, and several others. The most famous, the 119th Psalm, which does a repeating pattern of this. It goes through all the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So every verse starts with the letter Aleph, and then Beit, and then Gimel, and Dalet, and so on. And it goes right on down through the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So the first letter of each of the words of each statement is a different letter of the Hebrew alphabet. This is one of those examples. So it's a beautiful poem along with being a prophecy. But this is a woman of great spiritual resolve. This is somebody who has the ability to stand under whatever kind of stresses she's going through. And you're going to have to be, if you're going to be a mother, because mothers, just like fathers, men, have to endure some very difficult things. There's things you're going to be challenged with as a parent, or even someone that takes responsibility for other people and is a mother, a father to them spiritually, that are going to be very difficult things. To see those you're hoping will follow in your footsteps or example or will listen to you not do so can be heartbreaking. To see those that you're trying to influence or help, especially if it's your own children, leave the Lord or not remain faithful is a heartbreaking thing. To see them make choices that hurt them when if they'd listened to you, perhaps they would have been safe because you've learned those things. That's one of the great advantages of a parent. As you get older, in your teens especially, you get to a place where most young people, not all, some young people seem to just slip past this challenge. And it's astonishing when I see it happen. But most young people get to a place where they need, and it's part of the natural growth process, they need to challenge how they're living their life. You think that's just a negative? It's not a negative. They need to establish for themselves some things. They're becoming adults, and they do need to make some choices based on their own convictions. But we pray to God, we bury the convictions of the Scripture so deep in their hearts that when they finally come to the place where they've come to the end of their analysis of what should I do, it's always going to come back to what the Lord wants me to do. So I pray for you young people, that's exactly what occurs. There's a number of points in the description of this virtuous woman that, as I said, are related to her relationship with her husband, but there's many of them that are also related to her relationship to her children, her family as a whole. And it shows how it could be applicable to any individual who has relationships that require integrity and a high degree of investment. There is no higher degree of investment in a relationship than you're going to have in a marriage relationship or in the relationship you have with your children. Down in the 16th verse, it says, she considereth a field and buyeth it with the fruit of her hands. She planteth a vineyard. That seems like a strange one for me to pick out. We could read through the whole thing. A lot of it has to do with her industry, how hard of a worker she is, how dedicated she is, how self-sacrificial she is. I picked that one out for a reason, though. It struck me this morning. I was praying about our service, and I was thinking about our precious ladies, and some of them who have had to make very hard decisions in their lives, that are trying their best to reach their children, or maybe are separated from their children by death or distance. Sometimes all you can do is buy a field, and then work that field with all your strength, with the hope that your children will inherit the field that you bought and you've worked in. I'm doing that for my children right now, and it wouldn't matter if my children were grown and they were living somewhere else, or if my children were outside of the church. I pray to God they're not, but if they had left the church, what I'm doing right now by investing my life in this church and investing my life in the work of God, and this is what you ladies are doing as well if you're doing this same thing, is I am buying this field. I'm buying it for an inheritance for my children, because one day I'll be gone. And this labor, I'm not talking about this assembly, I'm talking about this whole thing, this whole package. This labor that I have invested in, I hope they will inherit. If they're living far away, if they haven't been to church in a long time, if they've rejected the Lord, or any of the other categories somebody could be in, I'm going to still keep working in the field. I've got to keep working in the field, because one day it may be God will get their attention if they've left the Lord, and they'll come running to the field. The prodigal's father kept things going, and I'll bet he was on his knees every night crying out for his son, Lord, will you bring him home? And then he went to meet him when he was running home. There's a field that God has called us to work in, saints. We're working in a field right now, and we are going to produce some fruit in this field if we work it right. I'm just hoping it's the kind of fruit that, coming all the way full circle back to the first songs we were singing, has such a fragrance that is so strong that the wind starts blowing, and that fragrance blows out across Ohio and over into Illinois, Sister Sharon. That fragrance blows out across Ohio, and I can promise you it can do this very thing. That fragrance blows out into other parts of the country. I'm going to start naming parts, and every one of you can pick out people in these different parts. I'm not going to say parts where we all have children. Starts blowing out into those different parts of the country. I'm going to tell you what, you can be halfway around the world and the fragrance of this assembly can reach you. It can. If God wants to let the wind start blowing, what's going on will reach you. It'll reach you by somebody calling you and talking to you. Maybe you'll feel something. It'll reach you maybe because somebody sent you a note or a letter or an email or a text or whatever other form of communication, and it touched something in your heart. It doesn't even need to reach you through mediums of communication that we have available to us. I have prayed prayers, saints, about individuals who I had not seen in a long time, and I could not hunt them down because I didn't even have a number for them. But I have prayed some prayers, and I've even preached some messages and taught some lessons in this assembly that without ever being heard by the individual, it wasn't online somewhere, it wasn't on a CD, nobody sent them a message, touched the heart of somebody hundreds of miles away and turned them to the Lord. I mean, I've experienced it. I had one individual, I was praying, they came to my mind, and it was so heavy, I got down on my knees and started pleading for God. I hadn't talked to him in years, but I got down on my knees and started pleading with God. He put a terrible burden on me. Do you know the very next day, after years of never hearing from that person, they called me? You think God can't reach out through mediums that are far more supernatural than you and I have access to? Do you know there's been several times, I know some of you know, because a couple of you, Kevin might have been here one time it happened. Several times people were driving down this road when something was going on at this assembly, and they had driven past who knows how many churches. You're going to drive past 2 just going a few blocks. You'll drive past 1 on that side, you'll drive past 1 on this side, you'll drive past 3 just going a few blocks, besides our church. And they drove past here, and I know several of you experienced this. And the Spirit of God touched them driving by, and they said they felt something reach all the way out of this church and touch them in their car as they were going by. You think God doesn't have access to mediums of communication? I'm talking about communicating with your heart, not just giving you a phone call. That can reach people that are far more powerful than you and I have access to. With all the mediums of communication we have, all the technology we have at our fingertips to be able to say hello to somebody or say, I miss you, or whatever the case might be, or I was thinking about you, I've been praying for you. We better do all those things. We better use all the mediums of communication we have to try to reach out to people. Why would we not? If God's blessed us with the technology where we can, I'm going to use any medium of communication I am capable of using properly, that's the key, to reach out to people. If you think Paul wouldn't go preach into the doors of a temple to get some people out, you are not knowing Paul very well. Do you know where Paul went to preach one of his messages that is in the 17th chapter of the book of Acts? You know where Paul went? He went right up to the worst pagan place in the entire city, of one of the worst pagan cities in the entire world. He went up to Mars Hill in Athens, the center of where all the judgments and a lot of the religious activity as well went on around there, religious judgments and things. And he went up there and got into a discussion with the highest elite of that culture, of one of the most civilized and elite cultures of that entire world. We're going to use whatever means we can to reach people, saints. He didn't reach very many. Somebody say, well, it sure wasn't worth it. You know, most of what happened, if you read the story, they mocked him, they made fun of him. And then a couple people, just a couple. That's all that it mattered. Do you realize if it would have been one, it'd be enough? I worked for a company that looked like a fantastic job for a little while, right after I left the bank. I worked for a company that looked like a great job, and for a little while it was a fantastic job. I was pretty much self-employed, but they were the marketing arm for me to get me business and investments. And that became one of the worst jobs when it came to its close. And after being at that job for about a year, I left that job and was recruited back to a bank and went back to a job that was much more stable and more reliable. First, it was a fantastic job. I was making a lot of money and things were going well. And then after I met Kevin, we did really good for a couple of months. We broke all kinds of sales records for several months, Kevin and I. Kevin was working as a person making calls and things for me, like an assistant. All of a sudden, Kevin came to church and things didn't start going so well at work anymore. Then Kevin got filled with the Holy Ghost. Things got even worse at work. We couldn't make any money if we wanted to. And we're both probably thinking to ourselves, what is this about? You know what, if you're not careful, you'd start doing? You'd start saying, well, maybe I shouldn't have come to church. Which would you rather have? You see, sometimes God's going to give you those options. You want the success out in the world, but that was only part of it, because the only reason God led me to that job was to get Kevin. And hasn't that been a precious thing, far more valuable to me than rubies? If you know everything Kevin has done for this assembly and for you that you may not even know about, he's done many things for me personally. He's been an angel of the Lord to me. I got driving down the road here the other day, and Hallie and I, we went out for a daddy and daughter day and drove around Ohio a little bit, visiting some trails and some weird, unique places like the Field of Corn down there in Columbus. That's the craziest thing I've ever seen. And the Chief Leather Lips Monument, which is just as crazy. We just went and looked at some oddball things. And Mark told us, Mike, that we needed to stop at Tommy's Pizza. That's the best pizza ever, he said. So Hallie and I had us lunch at Tommy's Pizza. And we're sitting there at Tommy's Pizza. We got out of there. I said, honey, we've got to get gas. We can only go like another 20 miles, 10 miles maybe. I said, we got to get gas. And I kept talking about getting gas, but we just got talking. You know what happens when you get talking? You don't pay attention. So we got about halfway back to Mansfield, and I looked, and it was on the distance to empty, not just the E. It said distance to empty 0. And I didn't know how long I'd been driving with it saying 0 at this point. It could have been 20 miles I'd been driving with it saying 0. And I thought, oh my Lord, it has been many years since I was foolish enough to run out of gas. Am I really going to do it today with my little daughter in the car? She's not little, she's a teenager, but little to me. Am I really going to do it with my baby girl in the car? And we're going to run out of gas on the side of 71. And the next exit was the exit we needed to get off at, 15 miles away. I thought, this is horrifying. You want to know whose number I called? Any man in this church would help me, and I'd love you for that. Could have called any of you. But the very first person that came to my mind, I said, I think I'm going to call Kevin, see if he's at the church. See if he can be on standby, when I run out of gas and I end up on the side of 71 somewhere. It's funny, we talked the whole way until I glided right off the expressway ramp into the BP at that Belleville exit. Somehow made it probably 40 miles with it saying distance to 0. And I told Hallie, I said, the angel of the Lord, maybe in spite of my own ignorance and stupidity of not filling up the gas tank, just pushed us right on down the highway and on into BP. But Kevin was there, and he would have been there in a minute for us if we needed him to run out with some gas. God got him right out of that situation. That was the point of that whole job, as far as I can see, because he got me right back into the bank in a better position at the bank than I'd been in before. That was the point. God wanted Kevin to be here, and God did that very thing, and God is so good at that. So I'm buying a field, saints, and that's what you mothers need to do. You need to buy a field, invest in this. Say, this is where I'm invested. And then I hope if we buy a field, the fruit of our hands will one day be something that can reach our children. They'll smell the fragrance of that fruit. And maybe before it was distasteful to them, before they wouldn't have accepted it, but all of a sudden that smell smells better than anything they've ever smelled in their lives. I've got to find where that smell is coming from. And they cross states, they cross hundreds of miles. Who knows how far they might come to find the source of the fragrance. God in heaven, touch the hearts of our children, of our precious people in this church. A couple more verses, I'm going to close here. My wife told me this morning, which is kind of humorous. She doesn't ever tell me how to do a service. I've heard of some preachers' wives in places where I'd heard of one preacher's wife one time sat on the front row and she would start jingling her keys when she wanted her husband to stop preaching. And he'd do it too. If she wasn't in the mood, she'd jingle the keys and that preaching would come to a close real quick. It wasn't one of our churches. It was somewhere else, but she's not like that at all. But she told me this morning, she goes, I know what you're thinking. We're going to have a lot less people out. You're thinking we'll just have a real short service. She goes, why don't you just let the Lord decide how long the service is going to be, honey? So we're letting the Lord decide how long the service is going to be, but we won't go too much longer. 17th verse says that she girdeth up her loins with strength and strengtheneth her arms. She perceiveth that her merchandise is good. Her candle goeth not out by night. You got to really realize your merchandise is good. What you've got is something that's worth having. You'll invest yourself in it. I'm talking about as a mother, as a woman of God, as any individual this would apply to. It certainly requires a great deal of self-sacrifice to be a godly mother. It requires a great deal of wisdom as well, as you'll see in these verses. It says, strength and honor her clothing, down the 25th verse. And she shall rejoice in the time to come. She openeth her mouth with wisdom. There's the wisdom. And in her tongue is the law of kindness. Got to have these kind of qualities if we're going to be the kind of example that we need to be. And you ladies, I know in this assembly have been epitomes of these kind of qualities. This is the kind of qualities you're going to have if we're going to be able to influence the generation to come. This is the kind of qualities that I believe God gave Lemuel's mother to tell her son. This is what I want you looking for in a wife. I want you to look for someone that's wise, that's kind, that cares about people, that loves her family, that's self-sacrificial. She's wise in the way she uses her words. We've got to be wise in the way we use our words, saints. Words can be devastating, or they can be some of the most powerful healing agents you're ever going to experience. Sometimes it's just words. We can lift each other up through our actions and our words. We can be wise with our words. You can use wisdom in the words you use. Encourage people. Don't discourage them. If somebody's in a bad spirit or in a bad state of mind or just wants to focus on negative things, either back away from that conversation or change the conversation. Don't encourage it. Don't build somebody up in the wrong things. You will build them up in something that is destructive to them. Don't enable somebody to destroy themselves. God forbid a mother would do that to her children, and this is the point of this. This kind of mother would never do it. She opens her mouth with wisdom. What can I say to my children to encourage them, to get them to be in the right state of mind, the right spirit? I'm asking you mothers in Zion, and you haven't failed me, saints. You haven't failed me. But I'm asking you, will you give words of encouragement to the rest of the people in this assembly? Will you give words of encouragement to the next generation? That's at the heart of that, Sister Alda. My daughter felt your words of encouragement sometimes. She's never forgotten your words of encouragement. But if you go on before us, Sister Alda, my daughter will never forget Sister Alda. She'll be just as alive to her as you are sitting right now, only about 10 feet from her. That's how much impact your words can have, saints, and they can have the same impact in a negative way. If you want to focus on what's going wrong, and I don't mean in our church, I hope nothing's going wrong in our church. If you focus on what's going wrong in your life, or you want to just get in a negative state of mind or get critical about things, God will give you opportunities to grow out of that. We had an opportunity just one of our other church services. That if you knew you were being given that opportunity, you were being given a prime opportunity to learn charity and to be patient. Something was going on. I'm not about to tell you what it is if you don't know. Something was going on in our church service which could have been very distracting, could have been very irritating. And a couple of times I just had to start smiling because I knew why God was letting it go on. And I was thinking to myself, will you please, Lord, teach that lesson to us that because we love people so much, we can endure some things, especially when they're not their fault. Sometimes people do things and act in certain ways that it's not their fault. Thank you, Lord, for letting us have these opportunities to learn charity and patience. I hope you're learning it. Hope you don't walk away from things that you think, well, that was aggravating and I'm in a bad attitude now. Then you didn't learn the lesson. And guess what that means? Did you enjoy it? Probably not. Well, because you didn't learn the lesson, you're going to get more of it. So thank you for introducing yourself to another wave of it, because that's exactly what you're going to get. If you don't learn the lesson, you're going to get it until you do. There's some lessons I've learned, and when I start seeing the lesson happen in front of me in a church service or in an interaction with somebody, I think, oh, my Lord, I'm so glad I learned this lesson. I can just sit and smile now and watch it happen because I've learned this lesson. It doesn't bother me. We all are going to go through things in our life where we're going to need charity. God is a good educator at teaching charity. He'll teach it in things you would think would be very strange ways, but He'll teach it if you'll learn it. The last few verses here. Her children arise up and call her blessed. That's what I hope all the children, whether you're young or old, are doing for their parents today, rising up and calling her blessed. My children rose up, and I wouldn't even think of this, my children rose up and called my wife blessed in a way that kind of shocked me. They wanted a whole bunch of ingredients yesterday. We went to or the day before, whenever it was, we went to the store. I thought, what in the world do you need all these breakfast ingredients for? The fact of the matter is, no matter if they still will probably argue with me about it, we already had almost all of them in the refrigerator. So we need some eggs. I said, we got eggs. We need some jelly. We got jelly. We need biscuits. That we didn't have. We need whatever else, some other stuff to make breakfast. And I started to figure out it's because they wanted to make breakfast for their mom. Now, knowing teenagers, I thought she's going to get this breakfast right before church. Time they wake up and get going, it'd be right before church. So I came out. I get up pretty early most time. I came out somewhere between 5 and 6. I don't know how in heaven's name you ladies did it. And it was hot. They had just been up, apparently. They were back in their beds asleep. They had just got up. I walked in there, and there's a plate of eggs, and there's biscuits, and there's jelly, and there's sausage, and it was a whole spread sitting on the table. I thought, that dog is going to have a fun time, and they won't even know it happened, because if he gets out, he sleeps in the room with Hallie at night. He gets out, he's going to have a feast, Hallie, because he don't care. He'll get up on the table if that's what it takes to get him some sausage. Destiny got up and found that. Her children arose and called her blessed. Her husband also, that's what I'm doing right now, and he praised her. Many daughters have done virtuously, but thou excellest them all. Favor is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman that feareth the Lord, she shall be praised, and she ought to be praised. A woman that feareth the Lord ought to be praised. And that's one of the things we're doing this afternoon, is we want to bring some praise to our ladies. Give her the fruit of her hands, and let her own works praise her in the gates. In other words, wherever she goes, let her works praise her. Let her get credit for what she's done. And if I could go through, we've gone late today already, so I'm not going to do this, but if I could, I'd just go through and talk about each one of you ladies and how your works ought to be praised in the gate that is this assembly. What you've meant to this assembly, what you've done for this assembly, how much we love you and how much we appreciate you, because we do. We appreciate the spirit that you've added to this assembly and the change that it creates in the atmosphere of this place, having you here, having you a part of this work. So thank you, ladies. Happy Mother's Day to each and every one of you. We love and appreciate you.